Coming up on Arirang News, South Korea reports more than 200 cases of COVID-19 for a third day in a row, prompting the authorities to consider a stricter level of social distancing. The government allocates nearly $20 billion for projects next year under the Korean New Deal. According to President Moon, the digital and green aspects of the project are a historic task that transcends borders. And Korean Air is moving ahead with a bid to become the largest shareholder of its rival Asiana Airlines, which is strapped for cash and struggling to survive in the pandemic. It's 5 p.m. here in Seoul. Thanks for tuning in to Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. South Korea is looking seriously at raising the level of social distancing now that there have been more than 200 cases of COVID-19 for each of the past 3 days. Most of them are in the greater Seoul area. Our Han Sung-woo has more.
South Korea recorded 223 new COVID-19 cases on Monday, the third day in a row that it has seen over 200 new infections. Of the newly reported cases, 193 were transmitted locally, with Seoul and the surrounding area accounting for 128. These include extra cases stemming from cluster infections at a care center, a military welfare center, and a subway station in Seoul, as well as medical facilities across Gyeonggi-do province. 30 cases were from overseas. Regions outside the capital have also seen numbers rise considerably, with Gangwon-do province reporting 20 new infections. This has prompted health authorities to seriously consider raising the social distancing level to level 1.5 in the capital area and Gangwon-do province. Most of the country has remained at level 1 under the new 5-tier system rolled out earlier this month. But some cities have already raised their measures to level 1.5. The total number of cases now stands at a little under 28,800. 55 patients are currently in critical condition, and the virus has claimed one more life, bringing the death toll to 494. Han Sung-woo, Arirang News.
A non-partisan delegation of South Korean legislators have agreed to move ahead with trips to the United States to establish connections with officials who could figure into an administration under U.S. President-elect Joe Biden. The delegation will include Speaker Park Byung-seok, the floor leader of the ruling Democratic Party, Kim Tae-yeon, and the floor leader of the main opposition People Power Party, Joo Ho-young. Also this week, the Democratic Party's Korean Peninsula Task Force is visiting Washington, D.C. for 5 days. They're expected to meet with Congressman Brad Sherman, who serves on the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Asia, and with Deputy Secretary of State Stephen Biegun. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has made his first public appearance in more than 3 weeks, presiding over a Politburo meeting on Sunday. Kim reportedly reprimanded a Workers' Party committee from the Pyongyang University of Medicine for committing what he called a serious crime, the details of which were not reported. Also discussed at the Politburo were measures against COVID-19, but there were no comments on the U.S. presidential election. Kim's sister, Kim Yo-jong, was at the meeting as well. The government next year is planning to invest more than $19.2 billion in projects under the Korean New Deal. Finance Minister Hong Nam-ki announced the budget during a New Deal strategy meeting on Monday, which covered 4 strategies, including investment, as part of ensuring that the project benefits the people. President Moon Jae-in emphasized that the Korean New Deal will enable the country to transition into a society of the future, now at a critical turning point in history. Take a listen.
디지털 혁명과 그린 혁명은 문명사적 대전환으로 이념과 정파는 물론 국경을 초월한 시대적 과제가 되었습니다. 피해갈 수 없고 다른 선택이 있을 수 없습니다.
The Korean New Deal, he said, will continue to evolve and develop, and the government will actively support the National Assembly and the ruling party's efforts to find creative ways to include the people in this project. South Korea's biggest air carrier, Korean Air, is moving ahead with plans to acquire Asiana Airlines, its main rival. The state-run Korea Development Bank is going to invest more than $700 million to facilitate the acquisition, which is expected to help both of the airlines struggling in the pandemic. If the merger goes ahead, Korean Air will become the 10th biggest airline in the world. Ji-young reports.
South Korea's flagship airline Korean Air is pushing ahead with its bid to acquire its biggest local rival, Asiana Airlines. At a ministerial meeting on Monday, government officials gave their approval for Hanjin Group, the owner of Korean Air, to take over cash-strapped Asiana, the nation's second-largest carrier. The CEO and the chairman of the state-run Korea Development Bank said the deal is largely aimed at helping the local airlines survive amid intensified competition in the global aviation industry and the damage caused by the coronavirus pandemic.
Under the deal to combine Korean Air and Asiana Airlines to raise their competitiveness, the state-run Korea Development Bank would invest around $722 million.
Should the deal happen, it would give Korean Air a more than 60% stake in Asiana Airlines, which would make it the largest shareholder. Korea Development Bank's chairman also said amount of government funds injected to normalize the local airlines would be minimized through the acquisition and added that it would create synergies.
This deal will create a competitive national carrier that will be one of the top 10 in the world.
The combined airline would have more than 75% of the domestic market share on passenger routes to the Americas and major cargo routes. However, challenges lie ahead as the country's antitrust watchdog still has to give the deal its approval. And private equity fund KCGI, a major shareholder in Korean Air's holding company Hanjin Kal, is opposing the deal. Also, as the acquisition would lead to the streamlining of the two businesses, labor groups are also likely to voice their opposition. Ji-young, Arirang News.
Time now for an in-depth look at the market news this afternoon, and for that, I'm joined on the line by Dr. Yang Jun-seok, professor of economics at the Catholic University of Korea. Professor Yang, thank you for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
Well, stocks ended strongly higher at the end of last week on Wall Street. Anticipation for some vaccines to come out. Here in Korea, the Kospi now above 2,500 points. What's the story in the global markets today?
Okay, well, as you just stated, the U.S. stock market has a very good week last week. It generally went up, except on Thursday when all three major indices went down, but it recovered more or less on Friday. S&P rose 2.2% for the week. Dow rose 4% for the week. NASDAQ rose 0.6% for the week. Now, the popular interpretation is that the optimism about the vaccine is outweighing everything else. But then you also have to remember that last week, or 2 weeks ago, when the news of the vaccine came out, it drove the market, NASDAQ especially, somewhat lower because it had a negative effect on the tech stocks. But still, this week or last week, it does seem like people are viewing it more optimistically, and while the tech stock hasn't gone back to being a very high growth stock, it does seem to be recovering fairly nicely. Now, there was also some other news, especially concerning the so-called value stocks versus the growth stocks. AJO Partner is planning to shut down their $10 billion fund because they've specialized in value investment, but value investment hasn't done better than growth stocks, and apparently they are shutting off their operations. This just shows generally over the last 10 years or so that the value stocks hasn't seemed to be doing very well, especially compared to growth stocks, though there's different interpretations on why that may be so. Now, in Europe, FTSE, DAX, CAC, Euro 50, they all had a very good early part of the week, but toward the end of the week, the markets didn't do as well. It either fell or remained stable. Asian markets, it's been showing a very mixed results last week and today. Nikkei had a very rapid rise last week, and today Hong Kong It had slower growth over last week. Shanghai, it fell last week, but all three indices did seem to rise today. Kospi, it rose steadily last week and today. It seemed to be doing very well with foreign investors. They've been concentrating on semiconductors. Today, Samsung went up by 4.91% and SK Hynix went up by 9.25%. Apparently, they're very bullish on the possibility of semiconductors next year. They're foreseeing a very high increase in sales, even though if you look back on the beginning of the year, their estimates for what it was going to do this year was very mixed, but next year they seem to be very optimistic, the international investors. Kosdaq, it was flat last week due to the tech stock holds, but still for this week, it seems to be starting out with a fairly good increase.
Well, over the weekend, we saw the signing of RCEP, the free trade deal between 15 countries, including South Korea. Tell us about this deal and what effects we might expect it to have.
Okay, well, it's a mega FTA within the Asian region dealing with 15 countries. It includes the ASEAN 10 countries, plus Korea, China, Japan, and Australia and New Zealand. Originally, India was to be included as well, but last year at the final stages of negotiation, India dropped out. The negotiation started with the ASEAN countries, but soon became China-centric, so a lot of people argued that RCEP was a counterpoint to U.S.-led Trans-Pacific Partnership, but President Trump dropped out of TPP, and the RCEP negotiations actually accelerated because of that, because the Asian region economies, seeing that the U.S. under the Trump administration became more protectionist, they seem to be turning to RCEP to make the global trade more integrated and freer. Now, the RCEP includes about 30% of global GDP, about 30% of population, and as mentioned, its meaning is that it is a mega Asian region FTA. But for Korea already has FTAs with all the member countries except Japan. And the RCEP is considered a shallow integration. It's not considered in-depth, partially because it has ASEAN developing economies as well as India, who participated in the negotiation, and India wasn't really enthusiastic about opening its economy to China. So the effect is probably going to be a bit muted compared to other FTAs. KIEP, the government-run research organization, estimates that it'll increase the GDP by about 0.4 to 0.6%. Now, it does have further decreases in tariffs, which are not included in other Korean-related FTAs with these countries. Notable also is unified rules of origin. So Korea had different rules of origin with each of these countries in their FTAs, but now it'll be unified into one rule of origin, which should make paperwork a lot easier.
Well, now we're almost out of time, Professor. What's on your radar at the start of a new week in the days ahead?
Okay, well, on the Korean side, the most important statistics will not actually be statistics, but it'll be the housing market review. That'll show exactly how the housing prices as well as availability of 전세 housing as well as rental housing and housing sales are going to be doing. And this is expected to kick off another round of policies on housing and real estate. So that's probably going to be the big news, economic news for this week.
All right, Professor, we'll have to leave it there for today. Thanks so much for sharing your insights with us.
Thank you.
The maximum interest rate allowable by law in South Korea could be lowered from the current 24% down to 20%. Possible measures were discussed on Monday by the government and the ruling Democratic Party. The Democratic Party's floor leader said ordinary people are having a hard time paying such high rates, especially in the pandemic, and that those rates are not appropriate in the current environment of extremely low interest rates. Even with a lower rate, the floor leader said they would work to keep the supply of credit loans steady. The maximum rate was lowered to the current level 2 years ago from 30%. South Korea aims to use wind power to produce about 1/3 of its new and renewable energy. The country's now successfully localized the tech for wind turbines, and it's hoped that this will allow the domestic industry to really take off. Park Se-young has more.
More large wind turbines are being installed as part of efforts to cut emissions. Until now, tests for certification of turbine performance have relied on foreign technology. For the first time in South Korea, researchers were able to successfully perform power and mechanical load tests for a 5.5 megawatt maritime wind turbine and give it a certificate of conformity.
Type tests are essential for certifying wind generators within a system. We're testing wind turbines that can be certified during actual operations.
Type inspections check that the wind turbine is designed and built to meet global standards. Type testing using foreign technology is time-consuming and expensive, and there are concerns that domestic technology could be leaked due to the detailed measurement procedure.
We need to become technically independent, and with test technology, we can back our equipment technology. Then we'll be able to optimize our wind turbines.
Carrying out type testing using domestic technology is expected to accelerate the growth of wind power generation and help the industry sell its wind turbines abroad. Park Se-young, Arirang News.
And that does it for this newscast. Thank you for watching.